The haunting in the woods. Disturbing hunting encounters. 1. The Silent Stalker. It was a crisp autumn morning when Daniel, an experienced hunter, set out into the dense woods of northern Michigan. He had hunted in these woods for years, but this time something felt off. The forest, usually alive with the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds, was eerily silent. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the fallen leaves. As he trekked deeper into the forest, he began to feel as if he was being watched. At first, he dismissed it as nerves, but the feeling persisted. Every so often, he would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The feeling grew stronger, and soon it was undeniable. Something was following him. Daniel stopped in a small clearing and listened. The silence was deafening. He slowly scanned the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest. That's when he saw it, a dark figure just barely visible among the trees, watching him from a distance. The figure was tall, with long limbs, and moved with an unnatural grace. It didn't seem to be an animal, nor did it look human. He raised his rifle, but his hands were trembling so much he could barely aim. The figure remained still, just watching him. Daniel decided it was time to leave. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on the figure the entire time. As he turned to make his way back to his truck, he heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything he had ever heard before. Panic set in, and Daniel ran. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, matching his pace. No matter how fast he ran, the footsteps never grew fainter. He could feel its presence right behind him, but he didn't dare look back. When he finally burst out of the woods and into the open field where his truck was parked, the footsteps stopped. He threw himself into the truck and slammed the door shut. As he started the engine and sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure emerge from the tree line. But there was nothing there, just the silent woods. Daniel never returned to those woods again. To this day, he doesn't know what was stalking him that morning, but the memory of that silent stalker haunts him. 2. The Unseen Terror. Jake and his brother Tom had been hunting partners for years. They knew the Appalachian Mountains like the back of their hands. But one weekend, they ventured into a part of the forest they had never explored before, an area locals referred to as the Dark Hollow. The name didn't deter them. In fact, it piqued their curiosity. The brothers set up camp near a small creek and prepared for an evening hunt. As dusk fell, they began to notice strange things. The forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening and deepening in a way that made the trees seem almost alive. While stalking a deer, Jake suddenly felt an intense chill run down his spine. He froze, his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. He signaled for Tom to stop, but when he turned to look at his brother, Tom was gone. Panic surged through him. He called out for Tom, but the only response was the echo of his own voice. He searched the area frantically, but there was no sign of his brother. As night fell, Jake could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. The forest was unnaturally dark, as if the very air had thickened into a suffocating blackness. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible, and all around him. Jake's heart pounded as he tried to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. Without warning, Jake was knocked to the ground by an unseen force. He scrambled to his feet, but the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He could feel something circling him just out of sight. In a blind panic, he fired his rifle into the darkness. The whispers stopped, and for a brief moment there was silence. Then, from the darkness, came a sound that Jake would never forget, a piercing scream, like that of a dying animal mixed with the cries of a human in agony. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, something otherworldly and malevolent. Jake ran. He ran faster than he ever had in his life, the scream echoing in his ears, chasing him through the darkness. When he finally burst out of the forest and into the clearing where their camp was, he found Tom sitting by the fire, looking as if nothing had happened. Tom claimed he had never left Jake's side, that he had been sitting by the fire the entire time. Jake knew what he had experienced, but he could never explain it. To this day, he avoids the Dark Hollow, and the memory of that unseen terror lingers in his mind, a nightmare he can never escape. 3. The Skinwalker's Trail. In the remote wilderness of New Mexico, Mark and his friend Pete were on a hunting trip deep in the heart of Navajo country. They had heard the legends of skinwalkers, shapeshifters who could take on the form of any animal or human. But to them, these were just stories, something to scare children around the campfire. That was until they encountered something they couldn't explain. It started with strange animal tracks they found near their campsite. The tracks were large, almost bear-like, but something about them was off. The claw marks were too long, too deep, and they seemed to change shape as they followed them, sometimes appearing like a bear's, other times like a large wolf, and then something unrecognizable. As night fell, they heard the howls, long, mournful cries that echoed through the mountains. But these howls were different from any animal they had ever heard. They were almost human, filled with a sorrow that chilled them to the bone. Mark and Pete decided to stay close to the fire that night, their rifles by their sides. The howls grew closer, and the men could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. The movement was quick, darting from one shadow to the next, always just out of sight. Then the figure appeared, a large, shadowy shape, moving on all fours but with a gait that was disturbingly human. Its eyes glowed in the firelight, reflecting an unnatural intelligence. Mark and Pete froze, not daring to move. The creature circled their campsite, its eyes never leaving them. Suddenly, it stood up on two legs, towering over them, its form shifting and twisting, as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. In a voice that was a horrible mixture of animal growl and human speech, it spoke, a single word that neither of them could understand, but it filled them with an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature dropped back to all fours and vanished into the darkness. Mark and Pete didn't sleep that night. They packed up at first light and left the area as quickly as they could. They never spoke of what they saw, not even to each other. But the memory of that night stayed with them, a haunting reminder that some legends are based in truth. The Navajo stories of the Skinwalkers were no longer just tales, they were a terrifying reality that they had narrowly escaped. 5. The Abandoned Cabin. In the remote wilderness of Alaska, a group of 4 hunters set out on what was supposed to be a routine expedition. The area they chose was miles away from civilization, a place known for its abundant wildlife, but also for the strange disappearances that had occurred over the years. The first few days were uneventful, with the group bagging several deer and enjoying the solitude of the Alaskan wilds. But on the third day, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a cabin, old and weathered, nestled in a clearing surrounded by thick forest. The cabin didn't appear on any of their maps, and it looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. Curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to investigate. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, the cabin was furnished with the bare essentials: a table, a few chairs, and a bed covered in a thick layer of dust. There were no signs of recent occupancy, but something about the place felt wrong, like it was steeped in a lingering sense of dread. As they explored the cabin, they found strange carvings on the walls, symbols that none of them recognized, etched deep into the wood. One of the hunters, Greg, who was more superstitious than the others, urged them to leave, but the others laughed it off, attributing it to some old trapper's eccentricities. They decided to camp near the cabin for the night, figuring it would provide some shelter from the biting cold. But as darkness fell, an eerie feeling settled over the camp. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Then they began to hear noises, soft, shuffling footsteps, like something was moving just beyond the light of their campfire. At first, they thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. They shone their flashlights into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The night wore on, and the noises grew louder. The footsteps were joined by soft whispers, unintelligible but filled with a sense of malice. Greg was visibly shaken, insisting that they leave immediately, but the others hesitated, not wanting to venture into the forest in the dead of night. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut. The force of it startled them all, and when they turned to look, they saw something that made their blood run cold, a figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching them. One of the hunters, Tom, grabbed his rifle and fired at the figure, but the bullet passed through it as if it wasn't there. The figure slowly faded, melting into the shadows, but the sense of dread remained, stronger than ever. They didn't sleep that night, and as soon as the first light of dawn broke, they packed up and left, abandoning the cabin to whatever haunted it. They never spoke of what they had seen, but the experience changed them. Each of them carried the memory of that night with them, a reminder that there are places in this world where the past never truly dies, and where the spirits of the dead are not at rest. 6. The Cursed Forest. In the heart of Romania's Carpathian Mountains lies the Hoia Forest, a place infamous for its paranormal activity and dark history. Many locals believe the forest to be cursed, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. This didn't deter Adrian, an avid hunter, from venturing into its depths, determined to track a large boar he had been stalking for weeks. The forest was unlike any he had hunted in before. The trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, as if the forest itself was alive and watching him. Adrian soon realized that he was not alone. He began to hear strange sounds, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, footsteps that matched his own, and a low humming that filled the air. He tried to shake it off, attributing it to his imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. As he pushed deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling his name, urging him to go deeper, to lose himself in the labyrinth of trees. He could feel something pulling him, a force that was both terrifying and irresistible. Then he saw it, a figure standing among the trees, watching him. It was a woman, dressed in old, tattered clothes, her face pale and gaunt. She didn't move, just stared at him with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul. Adrian tried to approach her, but as he did, she vanished, leaving only a cold breeze in her wake. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining like a cage. Adrian's heart raced as he realized he was lost. No matter which direction he turned, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of the path he had come from. The whispers became louder, more desperate, and he could feel the presence of something malevolent closing in on him. In his panic, he began to run, but the forest wouldn't let him escape. The trees seemed to shift and move, blocking his path, trapping him in a never-ending nightmare. As night fell, the forest came alive with shadows that danced and twisted in the darkness. Adrian could see figures moving in the corners of his vision, always just out of reach. He heard laughter, cruel and mocking, echoing through the trees. The whispers turned to screams, filling his ears with a cacophony of voices, each one more terrifying than the last. By the time the sun rose, Adrian was a broken man. He stumbled out of the forest, his clothes torn and his body covered in scratches and bruises. He had no memory of how he had escaped, only the lingering terror of the night he had spent in the cursed forest. Adrian never spoke of what happened in the Hoia forest, but the experience left him a changed man. The once confident hunter was now a shadow of his former self, haunted by the memories of the whispers, the screams, and the woman who still watched him in his dreams. 7. The Wailing Wendigo. In the remote forests of Canada, there exists a legend older than time itself, the Wendigo. This creature, once human, is said to have been transformed by the consumption of human flesh, cursed to roam the woods for eternity, driven mad by insatiable hunger. Most dismiss the tale as a campfire story, but for one hunter, it became a living nightmare. Jack had been hunting in the dense boreal forests for years, but he had never ventured into the deeper parts of the wilderness until that fateful winter. The snow was thick and the cold was biting, but Jack was determined to track the elk he had spotted the day before. He followed the tracks deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around him like a wall. As the day wore on, the sky darkened with storm clouds and a blizzard began to set in. Jack knew he needed to find shelter, and soon he came across an old, abandoned cabin. Relieved, he quickly made his way inside, the wind howling like a banshee outside. The cabin was small and decrepit, but it provided some refuge from the storm. Night fell, and with it came an eerie silence. Jack tried to sleep, but something kept him awake, a feeling of unease that he couldn't shake. It was then that he heard it, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the forest. It was a sound like nothing he had ever heard before, filled with sorrow and hunger. He grabbed his rifle and cautiously stepped outside, his breath visible in the freezing air. The snowstorm had calmed, and the forest was bathed in an eerie, pale light from the moon. But the wail continued, louder now, closer. Jack's heart pounded as he scanned the tree line, searching for the source. Then he saw it, a figure moving through the trees, tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The creature's eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, filled with sharp, rotting teeth. It was the Wendigo, and it was coming for him. Jack fired his rifle, but the creature didn't flinch. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Jack turned and ran, his boots sinking into the snow with every step. The Wendigo's wail filled the air, a sound of pure despair that seemed to pierce his very soul. He could hear it behind him, gaining ground, its breath hot on his neck. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jack threw himself into the thick underbrush, hoping to lose the creature in the dense forest. But the Wendigo was relentless, crashing through the trees with terrifying force. Just when he thought he was done for, the creature suddenly stopped, its wail turning into a pain screech. Jack turned to see the Wendigo retreating, as if something was holding it back. It let out one final, anguished cry before disappearing into the darkness. Shaking and terrified, Jack stumbled back to the cabin and barricaded himself inside. He didn't sleep a wink that night, his mind racing with the horror of what he had just encountered. When morning came, he wasted no time in leaving the forest, vowing never to return. Jack was never the same after that night. The memory of the Wendigo's wail haunted him, a reminder of the ancient evil that still lurks in the remote corners of the world, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too far into its domain. 8. The Ghost of the Old Man's Trail. In the dense forests of Oregon, there is a trail known only to the most seasoned hunters. Locals call it the Old Man's Trail, a path that winds through the mountains and is said to be haunted by the ghost of an old hunter who died there years ago. Most avoid the trail, but for Rick, an experienced outdoorsman, it was just another challenge. The day started off like any other hunting trip. Rick set out early, eager to track the deer that were plentiful in the area. He had heard the stories of the Old Man's Trail, but he didn't believe in ghosts. To him, the trail was just another path, and he was determined to conquer it. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the silence became, until it felt as if the forest itself was watching him. It wasn't long before he came across the first sign of something strange, an old, weathered hunting knife stuck into a tree. The blade was rusty, and the handle was worn smooth from years of use. It looked as if it had been there for decades, yet there was something unsettling about it. Rick pulled the knife from the tree and examined it, but there were no markings to indicate who it belonged to. He continued on, but the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic, leading him deeper into the forest. Then he heard it, a faint, raspy voice calling his name. Rick froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He was miles from civilization, and no one should have known he was there. He called out, but there was no response, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, a man, old and hunched, standing just off the trail. The man was dressed in ragged hunting clothes, his face obscured by a thick white beard. Rick felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the stories of the Old Man's Trail, of the hunter who had gone mad and died out here, his ghost doomed to wander the woods for eternity. But he had never believed them until now. The old man didn't move, just stood there, watching Rick with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Rick took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he turned to go, the old man spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Turn back." The words sent a jolt of fear through Rick. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, the trail twisting and turning beneath his feet as if it was trying to confuse him. The trees seemed to close in around him, and he could hear the old man's voice, now louder, following him through the forest. Finally, after what felt like hours, Rick burst out of the woods and into the clearing where he had started. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, his heart racing and his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. Rick never spoke of the old man's trail again, but he knew that the stories were true. The ghost of the old hunter still roams the woods, and those who venture too far down the trail might never return. 9. The Watcher in the Pines. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey are known for their dense forests and eerie atmosphere, but few dare to venture deep into their heart. The locals speak in hushed terms of a presence that watches from the shadows, a figure that has been seen by hunters and hikers alike. Some call it the Jersey Devil, while others believe it to be something even older, something that has been there long before humans set foot in the woods. For Tom, a seasoned hunter, the Pine Barrens were a familiar territory. He had spent countless hours tracking deer and other game through the thick underbrush. But one autumn day, while hunting alone, he experienced something that would change him forever. It started with the feeling of being watched. Tom had felt it before, but this was different. It wasn't the usual alertness of prey sensing a predator. This was something more sinister, as if the very forest had eyes. The feeling intensified as he moved deeper into the pines, the trees closing in around him like a wall. As the day wore on, he began to notice strange things. A sudden drop in temperature, the sound of footsteps that weren't his own, and glimpses of a shadowy figure moving just out of sight. Tom was a rational man, but even he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. He decided to set up camp early, hoping that a fire and some rest would calm his nerves. But as night fell, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The fire's light seemed to do little to dispel the darkness, which pressed in on him from all sides. The sounds of the forest, usually a comforting presence, had gone silent. Then, in the flickering firelight, he saw it, a figure standing among the trees, tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching him. Tom's heart raced as he tried to get a better look, but every time he thought he could make out its features, it seemed to blur, as if it was part of the darkness itself. He grabbed his rifle, but something told him it wouldn't help. The figure seemed to sense his fear, and slowly it began to move closer, gliding silently through the trees. Tom backed away, his mind racing with the impossibility of what he was seeing. The figure stopped just at the edge of the firelight, and for a moment Tom thought he could see eyes. Cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Suddenly, the fire flared up, casting a blinding light. When Tom blinked and looked again, the figure was gone. The forest was silent once more, but the feeling of being watched remained. He didn't sleep that night, keeping his rifle close and the fire burning until dawn. When morning came, Tom packed up and left the Pine Barrens, vowing never to return. He knew that whatever he had seen was no animal, and it wasn't human either. It was something ancient, something that had been watching the forest for centuries, and it didn't want him there. Tom's story became just another tale among the many that circulate about the Pine Barrens, but for him it was all too real. He still wakes up at night, haunted by the memory of those cold, unblinking eyes, and the feeling that something is always watching. 10. The Blood Moon Hunt. In the remote mountains of Montana, there is a legend among the local Native American tribes about the blood moon, a rare lunar event that occurs only once every few decades. During this time, the boundaries between the physical world and the spirit world are said to weaken, allowing ancient spirits to cross over and walk among the living. Most dismiss these stories as mere superstition, but one hunter learned the truth the hard way. Ethan had heard the tales of the blood moon, but he didn't believe in spirits or curses. To him, it was just another hunting trip, an opportunity to track elk in the rugged mountains. He set out alone, confident in his skills and experience, unaware of the danger that awaited him. As night fell, the sky took on a strange reddish hue, the full moon glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Ethan made camp in a small clearing, the silence of the mountains broken only by the distant howl of a wolf. He sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, when he noticed something strange. A figure standing on the ridge above him, silhouetted against the blood-red moon. At first, he thought it was another hunter, but as he looked closer, he realized that the figure was too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching him. A sense of unease crept over Ethan, but he tried to shake it off. He was miles from civilization, and there was no way anyone else could be out here. But as the night wore on, the figure remained, its presence unsettling and wrong. Then the wind changed, carrying with it a foul, metallic scent that made Ethan gag. The fire flickered, and he heard a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. He grabbed his rifle and shone his flashlight toward the ridge, but the figure was gone. In its place were glowing red eyes staring at him from the shadows. Panic set in as Ethan realized he was not alone. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and he could hear something moving through the trees, circling his camp. He fired a shot into the darkness, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the night. The creature, whatever it was toying with him, its eyes disappearing and reappearing in different spots, always just out of reach. Ethan could feel his fear growing, threatening to overwhelm him. He knew he had to get out of there, but the darkness seemed to close in around him, the path back to safety lost in the shadows. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature charged. Ethan barely had time to react, firing his rifle blindly as the thing lunged at him. He felt a searing pain as claws raked across his arm, and he stumbled backward, tripping over a log. The creature loomed over him, its breath hot and foul, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. But just as it was about to strike, the blood moon began to fade, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The creature let out a furious scream, retreating into the shadows as the night gave way to day. Ethan lay there, bleeding and terrified, as the sun rose and the nightmare finally ended. He was found hours later by a search party, delirious and on the brink of death. They never found any trace of the creature, and the doctors attributed his injuries to a bear attack. But Ethan knew the truth. He had come face to face with something ancient, something that only emerged under the light of the blood moon. Ethan never hunted again. The memory of that night haunted him, the scars on his arm a permanent reminder of the horrors that lurk in the darkness, waiting for the next blood moon to rise. 11. The Lost Hunter of Blackwood Forest. Blackwood Forest, known for its dense, towering trees and treacherous terrain, has been the site of many a hunter's adventure. But for Sam, it became a place of nightmares. He had heard whispers of the forest being cursed, of people disappearing without a trace, but he never believed in such tales. He was an experienced hunter, and the allure of the forest's untouched wilderness was too strong to resist. Sam set out early one morning, determined to track down a large buck he had spotted the previous day. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But as he ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, the trees seemed to close in around him, and the light from the sun barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Hours passed, and Sam realized he was lost. The trail he had been following had disappeared, and every direction looked the same. He tried to retrace his steps, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading him deeper into its heart. Panic began to set in as the day wore on, and he found himself in a part of the forest that felt utterly alien, as if he had crossed into another world. It was then that he heard the voice, a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "Help me." The words were barely audible, carried on the wind, but they sent a chill down his spine. He called out, but there was no response, only the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of running water. Sam followed the voice, hoping to find someone who could help him find his way out. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, leading him to a small clearing where he found an old, weathered hunting cabin. The door was ajar, and the inside was dark, but the voice seemed to be coming from within. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and a dusty old bed. But the voice persisted, now a desperate plea. "Help me, please." It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Sam pried up the wooden planks, revealing a small, hidden space beneath the cabin. What he found there froze him in place, bones, human bones, scattered among tattered clothing and rusted hunting gear. Among the remains was an old, leather-bound journal. With trembling hands, Sam opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to a hunter named Jacob, who had ventured into Blackwood Forest over 50 years ago. The entries described how he had become lost, just as Stan had, and how he had encountered a strange voice that led him to the cabin. But as the days passed, Jacob realized the voice was not that of a person in need, but something far more sinister, something that lured him deeper into the forest with the promise of safety, only to trap him forever. The The final entry was written in a shaky hand, the words barely legible. "It won't let me leave. I've tried, but it keeps leading me back here. The voice, it's in my head, and it's growing louder. I can't escape. I fear I will die here, just like the others before me. If you find this, please don't listen to the voice. Leave this place while you still can." Sam dropped the journal and scrambled out of the cabin, his heart pounding. The voice was still there, louder now, almost screaming in his ears. "Help me. Don't leave me." But he knew better. Whatever was in the forest, it wasn't human, and it wanted him to stay. He ran, not caring where he was going, only that he needed to get as far away from the cabin as possible. The forest seemed to shift around him, the trees twisting and warping as if trying to trap him. But he kept running, his breath ragged, the voice fading behind him. After what felt like hours, he burst out of the forest and into the open, collapsing onto the ground. He had no idea how he had found his way out, but he didn't care. He was safe. Sam never returned to Blackwood Forest, and he warned others to stay away. The voice still haunted his dreams, a reminder of the malevolent presence that lurked in those dark woods, waiting for its next victim. 12. The Eyes in the Dark. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest are a hunter's paradise, filled with deer, elk, and other game. But for Jason, a weekend hunting trip turned into a terrifying encounter with something he couldn't explain. Jason had been hunting in the area for years, always returning with a good haul. But this time, he decided to venture into a new section of the forest, one that was rumored to be cursed. The locals told stories of strange lights, eerie noises, and sightings of creatures that defied description. But Jason was skeptical and eager to explore the unknown. The first day was uneventful, with Jason setting up camp near a small stream. The weather was perfect, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling began to settle over him. The usual noises of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustling of leaves, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jason sat by the campfire, his rifle close at hand, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a pair of glowing eyes, watching him from the darkness beyond the firelight. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The eyes were large and bright, reflecting the firelight in an unnatural way. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jason slowly reached for his rifle, never taking his eyes off the glowing orbs. But as he did, the eyes suddenly disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Jason strained his ears, listening for any sound, but there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the pounding of his own heart. He stood up, his rifle at the ready, and scanned the surrounding forest, but there was no sign of whatever had been watching him. He tried to convince himself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something that shouldn't be there. He decided to stay awake, keeping the fire going and his rifle close by. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Just as he was beginning to think he might have imagined the whole thing, the eyes reappeared, closer this time, just beyond the edge of the firelight. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized there were more of them, dozens of pairs of glowing eyes surrounding him on all sides. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized he was completely surrounded. The eyes were watching him, unblinking, as if waiting for something. He raised his rifle and fired a shot into the darkness, but the eyes didn't flinch, didn't move. It was as if the bullets had no effect. Panic set in, and Jason did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed his gear and ran. He ran through the forest, the trees whipping past him, the eyes following him, always just out of reach. He could feel them, their presence closing in on him, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape them. Finally, after what felt like hours, he burst out of the forest and into a clearing. The eyes disappeared, leaving him alone in the moonlit clearing, gasping for breath. He collapsed onto the ground, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. Jason didn't return to his camp. He left the forest that night, abandoning his gear and swearing never to return. The memory of those glowing eyes haunted him, a reminder that there are things in the darkness that we may never understand, and some places are better left unexplored. 13. The Frozen Horror. In the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where the nights are long and the winters harsh, there exists a place known as the Dead Man's Pass. The name alone was enough to keep most people away, but for Roy, an experienced trapper and hunter, it was just another challenge. Roy had been hearing stories about strange occurrences in the area for years, people disappearing, strange lights in the sky, and eerie sounds echoing through the mountains. But he didn't believe in such things. He was a man of the wild, accustomed to the dangers of nature, and he prided himself on his ability to survive in the harshest conditions. One winter, he decided to set up his traps in Dead Man's Pass, convinced that the stories were just tall tales. The journey was treacherous, the snow deep and the cold biting, but Roy was determined. He set up camp near a frozen lake, the mountains towering around him like silent sentinels. The first few days were uneventful, with Roy checking his traps and preparing for the long winter ahead. But as the days passed, he began to notice strange things. The animals in the area were acting unusually skittish, as if something was scaring them. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible, but always present. Then one night, Roy was awoken by a loud crack, like the sound of ice breaking. He jumped up, his rifle in hand, and stepped out of his tent. The night was bitterly cold, the sky clear and filled with stars. But something was wrong. The frozen lake, which had been solid just hours before, was now fractured, deep cracks running through the ice. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl, like the sound of an earthquake. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and Roy realized with growing horror that the ice was shifting, something massive moving beneath it. He backed away, his breath visible in the freezing air, as the growling grew louder, more intense. The ice began to buckle and crack, and Roy could see something dark and massive rising from the depths of the lake. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, a creature, larger than any he had ever imagined, emerging from the frozen waters. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a monstrous amalgamation of scales, fur, and ice, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The creature let out a deafening roar, its voice echoing through the mountains, shaking the very earth beneath him. Roy did the only thing he could. He ran. He ran through the snow, the cold biting at his skin, the sound of the creature's growls following him. He could hear the ice cracking behind him, the creature giving chase, but he didn't dare look back. By the time he reached the edge of the pass, he was exhausted, his lungs burning from the cold air. The growling had stopped, and when he finally dared to look back, the creature was gone, the lake once again frozen and silent. But the memory of what he had seen was burned into his mind, a reminder of the horrors that lurked in the frozen wilderness. Roy left Dead Man's Pass and never returned. He warned others to stay away, to heed the stories and respect the power of the wilderness. The frozen horror was real, and he knew that anyone who ventured too close would not live to tell the tale. 14. The Howl of the Beast. The Appalachian Mountains are steeped in legend, with tales of ghosts, witches, and creatures that roam the dense forests. For many, these stories are just that, stories. But for Mike, a hunter with years of experience in the mountains, one of those tales became a terrifying reality. Mike had heard the story of the Beast of the Appalachians, a creature said to be part wolf, part man, cursed to roam the mountains forever. Most locals dismissed it as a myth, but a few claimed to have seen the beast, its howl echoing through the valleys on moonlit nights. One autumn, Mike decided to hunt in a remote part of the mountains, far from any roads or trails. The area was known for its game, and he was eager to bring home a prize buck. The first day went well, with Mike spotting several deer and setting up camp near a small stream. But as night fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest in an eerie silence. Mike sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the night, the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of owls. But as the night wore on, those sounds faded, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then, in the distance, he heard it, a long, mournful howl, unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, filled with a sadness that sent chills down his spine. Mike stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The howl echoed through the mountains, growing louder, closer. He scanned the darkness, his eyes straining to see through the fog. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. a large, shadowy figure moving between the trees. It was too big to be a wolf, and its movements were too fluid to be a bear. The creature was fast, almost too fast to follow, and it seemed to be circling him, its howl echoing through the night. Mike's heart raced as he realized he was being hunted. The creature's howl grew louder, more menacing, and he could hear its heavy footsteps approaching. He raised his rifle, his hands trembling, but before he could fire, the beast let out another howl, this one so loud and so close that it shook him to his core. The fog seemed to thicken, the fire's light dimming as the beast came into view. It was massive, standing on two legs like a man, but covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, predatory light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, glistening teeth. The beast let out a snarl, its breath visible in the cold night air, and Mike knew he was outmatched. He fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the silence, but the beast barely flinched. It lunged at him with terrifying speed, and Mike barely had time to dodge out of the way. The beast's claws raked across his arm, leaving deep, bloody gashes. He stumbled back, the pain searing through him, but he knew he couldn't stop. Mike turned and ran, the beast hot on his heels, its howls filling the night. He could feel its breath on his neck, hear the sound of its claws tearing through the underbrush. But somehow he managed to stay ahead, his instincts driving him forward, away from the beast and toward safety. After what felt like an eternity, he burst out of the forest and into a clearing. The beast stopped at the edge of the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on him, as if warning him not to return. Then, with a final mournful howl, it disappeared into the fog, leaving Mike alone and terrified. Mike made it back to civilization, but he was never the same. The memory of the beast haunted him, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the Appalachian Mountains. He never hunted there again, and he warned others to stay away, to listen to the howls of the night and heed the warnings of the locals. The beast of the Appalachians was real, and it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. 15. The Man in the Shadows. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest are a place of beauty and danger, with towering trees and mist-shrouded valleys. But for one hunter, those forests became a place of nightmares when he encountered something that defied explanation. Alex had been hunting in the Pacific Northwest for years, always returning with a good haul. But one summer, he decided to explore a remote part of the forest, far from the usual hunting grounds. The area was wild and untamed, with few signs of human presence, and Alex was eager to see what he could find. The first day went well, with Alex spotting several deer and setting up camp near a small river. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling began to settle over him. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of nature, was eerily quiet. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog rolled in, obscuring the trees and casting strange shadows. Alex sat by the fire, his rifle close at hand, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. He told himself it was just the isolation, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Then, as he was about to turn in for the night, he saw something, movement in the shadows just beyond the firelight. He froze, his eyes locked on the figure that seemed to be watching him. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. But there was something off about him, something that made Alex's skin crawl. The man's face was obscured by the darkness, but his eyes, those were unmistakable. They glowed with a faint, unnatural light, like two burning embers in the night. Alex called out, but the man didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there watching him. The fire crackled, casting flickering light and shadows that seemed to dance around the figure, but the man remained still, almost blending into the darkness. A cold sweat broke out on Alex's forehead as he realized this was no ordinary man. The stories he had heard around the campfire, stories of shadowy figures and forest spirits, suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. He slowly reached for his rifle, but the moment his hand touched the metal, the figure moved, fast, too fast for a human. In the blink of an eye, the man was gone, disappearing into the fog and darkness as if he had never been there. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the forest, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of the man. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. He didn't sleep that night, keeping his rifle close and his eyes on the darkness. But the man never returned, and by morning, The fog had lifted, revealing the forest in all its usual beauty. But Alex knew better. He packed up his camp and left the forest, vowing never to return. The memory of the man in the shadows haunted him, a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. The forests of the Pacific Northwest hold many secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. The man in the shadows was still out there, waiting in the darkness, watching those who dared to venture too far into the unknown. 16. The Screaming Woods. In the heart of England, there is a forest known as the Screaming Woods, infamous for the eerie sounds that emerge from its depths at night. The locals avoid it, especially after dark, but for Jack, a visiting hunter from America, the stories only fueled his curiosity. He had traveled to the UK for a hunting trip, and when he heard about the Screaming Woods, he knew he had to see it for himself. Jack set out one late afternoon, determined to spend the night in the woods and prove that the stories were nothing more than old superstitions. The forest was dense, with twisted trees and thick underbrush that made it difficult to navigate. As the sun set, a thick fog began to roll in, wrapping around the trees and reducing visibility to just a few feet. By the time night fell, the forest was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from Jack's campfire. He sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere began to change. The wind picked up, and with it came the first sound, a distant, high-pitched scream that echoed through the trees. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The scream was unlike anything he had ever heard. A mixture of human agony and something else, something primal and terrifying. He stood up, scanning the darkness with his flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the fog and the trees. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the sound was coming from all around him, as if the forest itself was alive and screaming. Then the voices began, whispers in the wind, unintelligible but filled with malice. They seemed to come from every direction, circling him, growing louder with each passing moment. Jack grabbed his rifle, his hands shaking, but he knew it wouldn't help against whatever was out there. The screams and whispers continued, rising to a deafening crescendo. Jack could feel his sanity slipping as the forest came alive with noise, a cacophony of horror that overwhelmed his senses. He had to get out, had to escape before the madness consumed him. He grabbed his gear and ran, plunging into the darkness, the sounds of the Screaming Woods following him. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, trying to pull him back into the depths of the forest. The screams grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest was angry that he was trying to leave. By the time he burst out of the woods and into the open fields, he was drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The screams stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his heavy breathing and the distant rustle of the wind. Jack collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his mind reeling from the experience. He never spoke of what happened in the Screaming Woods, but he never returned to England either. The memory of those screams haunted him, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. The Screaming Woods still stand, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to venture into their depths and hear the cries of the damned. 17. The Shadow of the Black Mountain. In the remote wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains lies Black Mountain, a place steeped in legend and fear. The locals tell stories of strange occurrences, of hunters who ventured into the mountain's shadow and never returned. But for Jake, a seasoned hunter, the mountain was just another challenge, a place to test his skills against the wild. Jake set out early one morning, determined to track a large buck that had been spotted in the area. The mountain was rugged, the terrain difficult, but Jake was undeterred. As he climbed higher, the forest grew darker, the trees thicker, blocking out the sun and casting deep shadows across the ground. By midday, Jake had reached a plateau near the summit, where he set up camp for the night. The view was breathtaking, the forest stretching out below him like a sea of green, but there was something unsettling about the place. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, as if the mountain itself was watching him. As night fell, the atmosphere grew even more menacing. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Jake sat by the fire, his rifle close at hand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, out of the darkness, he saw it, a shadow, moving between the trees, larger than any animal he had ever seen. The figure was massive, its form indistinct, blending with the darkness in a way that made it hard to focus on. But there was no mistaking the feeling of malevolence that radiated from it, a sense of dread that chilled Jake to the bone. He raised his rifle, aiming at the shadow, but it didn't stop moving, gliding through the trees with an unnatural grace. Jake fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the mountains, but the shadow didn't even flinch. It continued to move closer, its form becoming clearer as it approached the edge of the firelight. Jake could see now that it wasn't an animal, but something else, something that shouldn't exist. The shadow had no face, no features, just a black void where its head should have been. But it had eyes, two glowing red eyes that burned with a malevolent light, fixed on Jake with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He fired again, but the bullet passed through the shadow as if it wasn't there. Panic set in as Jake realized he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding, something that wasn't bound by the laws of nature. He grabbed his gear and ran, fleeing down the mountain, the shadow following him, always just out of sight. The descent was a blur of terror, the forest closing in around him as he stumbled through the darkness. The shadow was relentless, its presence a constant, oppressive weight on his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. By the time he reached the base of the mountain, he was exhausted, his body bruised and battered, but he was alive. Jake left the Appalachian Mountains that night and never returned. The shadow of Black Mountain remained with him, a dark presence that haunted his dreams, a reminder that some places are not meant to be conquered. The mountain still stands, its shadow long and dark, waiting for the next hunter to test their luck against the unknown. 18. The Forest of Forgotten Souls. In the remote corners of Siberia, where the winters are harsh and the nights endless, there is a forest known only to a few, a place where the souls of the lost are said to wander, unable to find peace. The locals avoid it, speaking of strange lights and voices that call out in the darkness. But for Victor, a hardened hunter, the forest was just another hunting ground, a place to find game and test his endurance. Victor set out in the dead of winter, the snow deep and the cold biting, but he was well prepared. The forest was silent, the trees heavy with snow, their branches drooping under the weight. It was a desolate place, but Victor was used to solitude, and the thought of ghosts didn't scare him. He spent the first day tracking a herd of elk, moving deeper into the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature dropped rapidly, and soon Victor found himself in near-total darkness, the only light coming from his lantern. He decided to set up camp for the night, knowing he would need to rest before continuing his hunt. But as the night wore on, Victor began to feel uneasy. The forest, usually so quiet, seemed to come alive with strange noises, whispers carried on the wind, the crunch of snow underfoot when no one was there, and the distant sound of crying. At first, he dismissed it as the wind or his imagination, but the noises grew louder, more distinct, until he could no longer ignore them. The whispers were soft at first, like the voices of children, but as the hours passed, they became clearer, more insistent. "Help us, find us." The voices seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the trees, and Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He stood up, his breath visible in the frigid air, and scanned the darkness with his lantern. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the snow, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the darkness beyond. But the voices continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Please, help us." Victor's instincts told him to leave, but something kept him there, a compulsion he couldn't explain. He began to walk through the forest, following the voices, his footsteps crunching in the snow. The deeper he went, the louder the voices became, until they were all he could hear, drowning out his thoughts. Then he saw them, figures moving through the trees, barely visible in the dim light. They were human, or had been once, but now they were pale, almost translucent, their eyes empty and hollow. The figures reached out to him, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help, but no sound came out. Victor's heart raced as he realized he was surrounded by the lost souls of the forest, trapped between life and death, unable to find peace. He tried to back away, but the figures closed in, their hands grasping at him, their touch as cold as the grave. Panic set in as Victor turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the voices still echoing in his ears. "Don't leave us. Help us." but he knew he couldn't help them, that he had to get out before he became one of them. He ran through the forest, the trees blurring around him, the voices fading as he put distance between himself and the spirits. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, he was exhausted, his body numb from the cold, but he was alive. Victor never spoke of what happened in the forest of forgotten souls, but he never hunted there again. The memory of the lost souls haunted him, a constant reminder that some places are beyond saving, and that not all who are lost can be found. The forest still stands, its trees heavy with snow, its secrets buried deep, waiting for the next soul to wander into its embrace. 19. The Beast of Shadow Creek. Shadow Creek, a small, isolated community nestled deep in the mountains, was known for its dense forests and abundant wildlife. But it was also known for something else, something darker. The locals spoke of a creature that roamed the woods, a beast that had been seen by few but feared by all. They called it the Shadow Beast, a creature of nightmare, and warned hunters to stay away from its territory. But Tom, a veteran hunter with years of experience, didn't believe in such stories. To him, the tales were nothing more than folklore, exaggerated over time. He had hunted in dangerous places before and saw no reason to fear a creature that likely didn't exist. So, when he heard about the deer population near Shadow Creek, he decided to take his chances. Tom set out early one morning, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and made his way into the forest. The air was cool, the ground covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, and the sky was overcast, casting a grey pall over the landscape. He followed a game trail, moving deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning for signs of deer. But as the day wore on, Tom began to notice strange things. The forest was unusually quiet, with none of the usual sounds of wildlife. The trees seemed taller, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the light and casting deep shadows on the forest floor. And then there was the feeling, the sensation of being watched, of eyes following his every move. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just nerves, but the feeling persisted. The deeper he went, the stronger it became, until it was almost unbearable. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of his presence, and it didn't want him there. Then he saw it, a shadow, moving between the trees, large and powerful. At first he thought it was a bear, but as he looked closer, he realized it was something else, something much larger. The creature moved with a fluid grace, its form indistinct, blending with the darkness in a way that made it hard to focus on. Tom raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest, but before he could fire, the creature vanished into the shadows. He stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what he had seen. But the forest gave no answers, only silence and the oppressive feeling of being watched. He decided to leave, making his way back toward the trailhead, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The shadows seemed to lengthen, the forest closing in around him, and he could hear the sound of something moving through the underbrush, following him. Tom quickened his pace, his rifle at the ready, but no matter how fast he moved, the creature was always there, just out of sight, stalking him. The sound of its breathing, deep and guttural, echoed through the trees, growing louder, closer. He broke into a run, the fear driving him forward, but the forest seemed to conspire against him, the path twisting and turning, leading him deeper into the darkness. The creature's growls grew more menacing, and he could feel its presence closing in on him. Finally, he burst out of the forest and into the clearing where his truck was parked. He didn't stop running until he was inside, the doors locked, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked back at the forest, expecting to see the creature emerge, but there was nothing there, just the dark, silent trees. Tom drove away from Shadow Creek and never returned. The memory of the Shadow Beast haunted him, a reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and that there are places in the world where the darkness is more than just the absence of light. The forest of Shadow Creek still stands, its secrets hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next hunter to venture too far into its depths. 20. The Lake of the Drowned. In the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota lies a lake known as Devil's Mirror, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. The locals speak of strange occurrences around the lake, of people disappearing without a trace, and of ghostly apparitions seen on the water's surface at night. But for David, an avid fisherman and hunter, these stories were nothing more than superstitions. David had spent years fishing in the lakes of Minnesota, but he had never visited Devil's Mirror. The rumors intrigued him, and he decided to see the lake for himself. He set out one early summer morning, the sky clear and the air crisp, and made his way to the secluded lake. The lake was beautiful, its waters calm and still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. But there was something unsettling about the place. The air felt heavy, and the usual sounds of nature were muted, as if the lake absorbed all noise. David set up camp near the shore, eager to spend a few days fishing and hunting in the area. The first day went by uneventfully, with David catching several fish and enjoying the tranquility of the lake. But as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. A thick mist rolled in, covering the lake and the surrounding forest in a blanket of white. The temperature dropped, and the lake's surface became eerily still, as if frozen in time. David sat by the fire, listening to the distant call of loons, when he noticed something strange. The reflection of the trees in the lake was distorted, twisted in a way that didn't match the real landscape. He stood up, puzzled, and walked closer to the shore, peering into the water. What he saw made his blood run cold. The reflection in the lake wasn't just distorted, it was wrong. The trees in the reflection were dead, their branches gnarled and twisted, and the sky was dark, filled with swirling clouds. But what scared him the most were the figures, pale, ghostly forms moving just beneath the surface, their eyes wide and hollow, staring up at him. David stumbled back, his heart racing. He looked around, but the real landscape was unchanged, healthy trees, a clear sky. But the reflection told a different story, one of death and despair. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down he knew better. As he backed away from the lake, he heard it, a soft, mournful wailing, like the cries of the drowned. The sound grew louder, more desperate, as if the souls trapped in the lake were calling out to him, begging for help. The mist thickened, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Then, from the corner of his eye, David saw movement, figures emerging from the lake, their bodies pale and bloated, water dripping from their clothes. They were human, or had been once, but now they were something else, something that shouldn't exist. Their eyes, dark and lifeless, locked onto David as they slowly advanced toward him, their mouths moving in silent screams. Panic set in, and David grabbed his gear, fleeing from the lake as fast as he could. The figures didn't follow, but their presence lingered, the wailing echoing in his ears as he ran through the forest, not stopping until he reached his truck. David left Devil's Mirror and never spoke of what he had seen. The memory of the lake haunted him, the images of the drowned souls burned into his mind. He knew that the lake was cursed, a place where the dead were trapped, unable to find peace, and that anyone who ventured too close would risk becoming one of them. The lake still stands, its waters calm and still, reflecting the horrors that lie beneath the surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to look into its depths. 21. The Curse of the Hollow. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies a secluded area known as Dead Man's Hollow, a place that has long been shrouded in mystery and fear. The locals refuse to go there, speaking of a curse that befell the Hollow centuries ago when an entire settlement disappeared without a trace. The stories tell of vengeful spirits and malevolent forces that haunt the area, but for Mark, a seasoned hunter, these tales were just ghost stories. Mark had heard about the large game in the area and decided to test his skills by hunting in Dead Man's Hollow. He set out early one autumn morning, the air crisp and the forest alive with the colors of fall. The journey was long and treacherous, but Mark was undeterred. He had hunted in remote areas before and had always come back with a good haul. As he neared the hollow, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew darker, the trees taller and more twisted, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the usual sounds of the forest. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves, faded into an eerie silence. Mark reached the edge of the hollow by midday, where he found the remnants of the old settlement, crumbling stone foundations overgrown with weeds, and the remains of a well long dry. There was something unsettling about the place, but Mark brushed it off, focusing on the task at hand. He set up camp near the edge of the hollow, intending to start hunting the next day. But as night fell, the sense of unease grew stronger. The fire he built seemed to barely hold back the darkness, which pressed in from all sides, thick and oppressive. Mark tried to sleep, but the silence was unnerving, and he found himself staring into the flickering flames, listening for any sound. Then, in the dead of night, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic chanting carried on the wind. It was low and guttural, the words in a language he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, malevolent and angry. Mark sat up, his heart pounding as the chanting grew louder, echoing through the hollow. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out of his tent, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. But there was nothing there, just the twisted trees and the crumbling remains of the settlement. The chanting continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with a sense of dread. Mark's instincts told him to leave, but he hesitated, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. But then he saw them, figures moving in the shadows, barely visible but undeniably there. They were human-shaped, but their forms were indistinct, as if they were made of the darkness itself. The figures moved closer, surrounding him, their chanting growing louder, more intense. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was not alone. The spirits of the cursed settlers had returned, and they were not pleased with his presence. He raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim. The figures continued to advance, their faces becoming clearer in the dim light. Twisted, angry visages, eyes burning with hatred. Mark knew he was facing something far beyond his understanding, something that could not be fought with bullets. Panic took over, and Mark did the only thing he could. He ran. He fled through the hollow, the chanting following him, growing louder, more frenzied. The spirits were chasing him, their forms darting through the trees, always just out of sight, but never far behind. By the time he reached the edge of the hollow, he was exhausted, his lungs burning and his legs trembling. But the chanting had stopped, the spirits no longer visible. He didn't stop running until he was far away, the cursed hollow behind him, but the memory of that night would never leave him. Mark never returned to Dead Man's Hollow, and he warned others to stay away. The curse was real, a dark force that still lingered in the hollow, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to trespass on its haunted ground. The hollow remains a place of fear and mystery, its secrets buried in the shadows, guarded by the restless spirits of those who were lost there long ago.